hello, pairing, connected.
Loves. Bypaths on the way to myself. Paris, England, Italy, Spain, Belgium, and Holland. This inquisitive nomadic wandering was not only pleasant in itself, but in many respects highly productive as well. Yet after all, and I realize this better than ever today when my roaming through the world is no longer a thing of choice, but a flight from the hounds. One has to have an anchorage from which one can set out, and to which one can always return. In the years since my school days, I had assembled a small library, and pictures and souvenirs, and my manuscripts began to pile up, but I could not drag this desirable burden around in my trunks all over the world. And so it was that I took a small apartment in Vienna, not as a permanent residence, but merely as a pied a terre, as the French so aptly call it. For up to the time of the world wore the feeling that everything was merely temporary dominated my life in some secret fashion. Nothing that I undertook, so I convinced myself, was the real, the actual thing, either in my work, which I looked upon as sketches leading to the real thing, with women with whom I was friendly. In so doing, I gave to my youth a sense of not yet being definitely burdened with responsibilities and, at the same time, the diletto for unhampered tasting, testing, and enjoyment. Arrived at an age when others had already long been married and had children and held important positions, and were obliged to produce the best that was in them with all their energy, I still regarded myself as youthful, a beginner who faced immeasurable time, and I was hesitant about final decisions of any kind. Just as I looked on my work as preparatory to the real thing, as a visiting card which was to announce my existence to the world of literature, so my rooms were to be nothing more than an address for the time being. I chose small quarters at the city's edge intentionally, so that my freedom was not weighted by costliness. The furniture that I bought was not particularly good, for I had no desire to tend it as my parents had done in their home, where every chair had its own slip cover which was only removed when company came. It was also my intention not to settle down in Vienna lest I might become sentimentally bound to a definite place. For many years I looked back on this self-training for the temporary as a mistake, but when later I was compelled once again to leave each home that I created for myself, and when I saw everything about me crumbling, this enigmatic instinct not to bind myself proved an aid. Acquired early, it made all loss and all leave-taking easier for me. I did not yet have many valuables to stow away in my first abode. The Blake drawing which I had secured in London hung on the wall, and one of Goethe's loveliest poems, written in his flowing freehand, was at that time the jewel in my autograph collection which I had already begun in the gymnasium. In the same herd spirit with which our entire literary group had written poetry, we hounded poets, actors, and singers for their autographs. And although most of us had given up the sport as we had given up writing poetry when we left school, the passion for these earthly shadows of genial personalities increased and intensified itself in my case. The mere signatures meant nothing to me, nor did the degree of international fame or value of any person interest me. What I sought was the originals or the sketches for poems or compositions, because the problem of the creation of a work of art, both in its biographical and psychological forms, held my attention more than anything else. That mysterious moment of transition in which a verse, a melody, emerges out of the invisible, out of the vision and intuition of a genius, and is graphically fixed in a material form. Where else can it so well be examined and observed as in the tortured or transborn manuscript of the master? I do not know enough about an artist if I am familiar only with his finished work, and I agree perfectly with Goethe when he says that to understand completely great creations one must have seen them not only in their perfection, but have pursued the process of their creation. The sight of one of Beethoven's first sketches with its wild impatient strokes, its chaotic mixture of motifs begun and discarded, and with the creative fury, the superabundance of his genius, compressed into a few pencil strokes, is physically exciting to me, because it is mentally exciting. I can look at such a scribbled page of hieroglyphics with enchantment and love, as others gaze upon a perfect picture. A proof sheet of Balzac in which practically every sentence is torn apart, every line plowed through. The white margin blackened with strokes, signs, and words represents to me the eruption of a human Vesuvius. And to see any poem that I have loved for years in its first draft, in its first earthly realization, arouses a religious awe in me, and I hardly dare to touch it. The pride of owning a few such leaves was accompanied by the sporting desire to acquire them, to hunt for them at auctions or in catalogs. How many tense hours do I owe to that chase? How many exciting incidents? Here I had come a day too late. There a desired piece proved to be a forgery, and again a miracle would occur. I had secured a small manuscript of Mozart's, but with joy impaired, for a scrap of the music had been cut away. Suddenly, the missing portion, which had been removed 50 or 100 years before by some loving vandal, turned up in a Stockholm auction. And now the aria could be put together just as Mozart had left it 150 years ago. Of course, in those days, my literary income obviously did not suffice to buy things in the grand manner. But every collector knows how much the joy of possessing a certain piece is enhanced if a sacrifice must be made to procure it. Furthermore, I demanded toll of all of my poet friends. Roland gave me a volume of his Jean Christophe, Rilke his most popular work Die Weiss von Liebe und Tod, Claudel his Land's Fate en Marie, Gorky a lengthy sketch, Freud a dissertation. They all knew that no museum could preserve their manuscripts more lovingly. How much of all this is scattered to the four winds today, with other lesser joys? I discovered only later, by chance, that the most unusual and most valuable literary museum piece was treasured not in my closet, yet in the same house. Above me, in an equally modest apartment, there lived a gray-haired, elderly spinster, a music teacher by profession. One day she spoke to me pleasantly on the stairs, saying that it worried her that I was an involuntary listener to her lessons, and that she hoped my work was not too much disturbed by the imperfect art of her pupils. In the course of our conversation, I learned that her mother lived with her, half blind and unable to leave her room. This 80-year-old lady was no less a person than the daughter of Goethe's physician, Dr. Vogel, and in 1830 Ottilie von Goethe, with Goethe present, was sponsor at her christening. I almost fainted. There was still one person on earth in the year 1910 on whom Goethe's sacred glance had rested. Now there had always been a particular sense of reverence in me for every earthly manifestation of genius, and besides my manuscripts, I collected whatever relics I could lay hands on. At a later time, in my second life, one room in my house was devoted to my cult, if I may so call it. There stood Beethoven's desk and the little money box out of which, when in bed, he drew the necessary change for the maid with a trembling hand already touched by death. There were also a page from his household book and a lock of his graying hair. For years I carefully preserved one of Goethe's quill pens under glass to avoid the temptation of taking it into my own unworthy hand. But how far beyond comparison with these inanimate objects was a person, a breathing, living being who had looked into Goethe's dark round eyes, knowingly and lovingly. A last thin thread, that might break at any moment, by chance united the Olympian world of Weimar with a modest house, Kochgasse 8, through this frail, earthly creature. I asked permission to call upon Mrs. Demelius. The old lady received me kindly and hospitably, and in her room I found many of the immortal's belongings which had been given to her by Goethe's grandchild, a friend of her youth, a pair of candlesticks that had stood on Goethe's table, and similar tokens of the house in the Frauenplan in Weimar. But was not she herself the real miracle? This old lady with a Biedermeier cap covering her thin white hair, as with her wrinkled mouth, she gladly told how she had spent the first 15 years of her youth in the house in the Frauenplan, which then had not yet become the museum it is today, guarding these things untouched since the hour when the greatest of German poets left his house and the world forever. As old people always do, she looked back upon her youth with intense objectivity, her indignation because the Goethe Society had perpetrated a grave indiscretion in having so soon published the love letters of her childhood friend, Ottilie von Goethe, was touching. So soon, she had forgotten that Ottilie had been dead for 50 years. To her, Goethe's darling was still alive and still young. Things that long since had become historic and legendary to us were still reality to her. I always felt a ghost-like atmosphere in her presence. Here I lived in this stone house, spoke over the telephone, burned electric lights, wrote letters on a typewriter, and but 22 steps above I was transported into another century and stood in the holy shadow of the world of Goethe. Later, I met many other women whose white heads reached upward into the heroic and Olympian world. Cosima Wagner, the daughter of Liszt, hard, strong, and yet majestic with her pathetic gestures. Elizabeth Forster, Nietzsche's sister, dainty, petite, and coquette. Olga Mano, the daughter of Alexander Herzen, who, as a child, had often sat on Tolstoy's knee. I have heard such an old man as George Brandes tell of meetings with Walt Whitman, Flaubert, and Dickens, or Richard Strauss describe how he saw Richard Wagner for the first time. But nothing touched me so much as the face of this venerable woman, the last among the living whom Goethe's I had deliberately looked upon. And perhaps I myself am now the last person who may say that I knew someone on whose head Goethe's hand had rested gently for a moment. A haven between journeys had now been found. More important, however, was another home that I had discovered at the same time, the publishing house that preserved and promoted all my work for 30 years. Such a choice is critical in the life of an author, and it could not have happened more fortunately for me. Some years earlier, a poetic dilettante of fine culture conceived the idea of utilizing his wealth for an intellectual purpose rather than for a racing stable. Alfred Walter Hamel, who was not of great importance as a poet himself, had decided to establish in Germany, where publishing was carried on mainly on a commercial basis, a publishing house which would make the criterion for the publication of a work not its commercial value but its content, with no view to material gain, but rather the prospect of continued losses. Light literature, profitable as it might be, was to be excluded. Contrariwise, even the most subtle and experimental was to be welcomed. To accept only works of the purest artistic expression in its purest form was the motto of this exclusive publishing house, which at first depended on a small clientele of real connoisseurs. With conscious pride in its isolation, it called itself Die Insel, the island, and later, the Inselverlag. Its books were not to be factory-made, but every opus was to be given an external distinction in the printed form which suited its inner perfection. Thus the title page, the letterpress, the face of type, and the paper for each book presented a new and individual problem. Even the prospectuses and the stationery of this ambitious publishing firm became the object of passionate pondering. I cannot recall, for example, that throughout 30 years I ever found a single printer's error in one of my books, or even a corrected line in a letter from the firm. Everything, even the smallest detail, aspired to be model. Hofmannsthal and Rilke were united in their lyric work in the Inselverlag, and their presence set the highest standard as the only valid one. One can readily imagine my joy and my pride in being honored, at 26, with permanent citizenship in this island. The external significance of this relationship was literary promotion. Inwardly, it meant increased responsibility. Whoever stepped into this select circle had to practice discipline and reticence. No literary flightiness was permitted him. He dared not be guilty of any journalistic haste, for the Inselverlag's colophon implied, at first for thousands and later for hundreds of thousands, not only a guarantee of textual quality, but also exemplary perfection of everything pertaining to the printer's art. Nothing happier can occur to an author than, when still young, to come upon a young publishing house and to grow up with it. Only such a common development truly creates an organic connection between him, his work, and the outside world. Soon I was bound by hearty friendship to the director of the Inselverlag, Professor Kippenberg, our friendship being strengthened by mutual understanding of our private collector's instincts and predilections. Kippenberg's Goethe collection developed parallel with the increase of my autograph collection for 30 years and became the most monumental ever brought together by a private person. He gave me valuable advice and often valuable warnings, and on the other hand, because of my special observation of foreign literature, I was able to give him important suggestions. So it was that the Incel Bukhariai, with its many millions of copies, was built like a mighty cosmopolis around the original ivory tower, making the Insel the most distinguished of German publishing houses, as the result of an idea that I proposed. After 30 years, things looked different than when we had begun. The slender undertaking had become one of the mightiest publishing houses, and the author who once appealed to only a limited circle, after all, was one of the most widely read in Germany. And in truth, it took a world catastrophe and the most brutal exercise of law to sever what had been a happy and congenial association for both of us. I must confess that it was easier for me to leave house and home than no longer to see the familiar imprint on my books. The path lay clear before me. I had begun to publish at an unseemly early age, yet I had an inner conviction that at 26 I had not created anything of substance. The finest conquest of my young manhood, the association and friendship with the best creative minds of the time, strangely enough became a dangerous hindrance to my productivity. I had learned true values all too well, and that made me hesitant. Because of this lack of courage, everything which I had heretofore published, except for translations, had been carefully limited to smaller forms such as short stories and poems. I was not bold enough to start a novel. That did not happen until nearly 30 years later. My first larger venture was in the dramatic field, and with this first attempt came a great temptation and certain favorable auguries that pressed toward succumbing to it. In the summer of 1905 or 1906, I had written a play. Naturally, in the style of our time, it was a drama in verse in the classic mode. It was called Thersites. My present opinion of that play, which now possesses only conventional significance, is evidenced by the fact that, as with nearly all of my books written before my 32nd year, I have never permitted it to be reprinted. Nevertheless, this drama announced a certain personal trait in my inner attitude which invariably never champions the so-called hero, but rather always see tragedy only in the conquered. In my stories, it is always the man who succumbs to destiny. In my biographies, the personality of one who succeeds not in a worldly way, but in the moral sense. Erasmus and not Luther, Mary Stuart and not Elizabeth, Castellio and not Calvin. That is what prompted me even then not to take Achilles as protagonist, but the least imposing of his antagonists, the suffering Thersites, instead of the figure who, through his power and self-certainty, makes others suffer. I did not show the finished work to any actor, even to those amongst my friends, for I was sufficiently worldly wise to know that dramas in blank verse and in Greek costume, even those by Sophocles or Shakespeare, are not good box office in the commercial theater. In a merely formal way, I sent copies to a few of the important theaters, and then I forgot the matter. Great was my astonishment when, after about 3 months, I received a letter on whose envelope was printed, Königliches Schauspielhaus Berlin. What can the Prussian State Theater want of me? I thought. To my amazement, the director, Ludwig Barnoy, formerly one of the greatest German actors, informed me that the play had impressed him profoundly, and that it was particularly welcome since in Achilles he had finally found the long-sought part for Adalbert Matkowski. He asked me therefore to grant the rights for the premiere to the Royal Theater in Berlin. I was almost terrified with delight. At that time, Germany had 2 great actors, Adalbert Matkowski and Joseph Keynes, the former a North German, unequaled in the primitive force of his personality, his overpowering passion, the latter, our Viennese Joseph Keynes, in whom audiences rejoiced for his intellectual grace, his inimitable diction, and the mastery of the vibrant as well as the metallic voice. And now that Matkowski was to personify my hero and speak my verses, and the principal theater of the capital of the German Reich was to be godfather for my drama, a glowing dramatic career, unsought by me, seemed to present itself. Since then I have learned never to anticipate the joys of a premiere before the curtain finally goes up. True, the actual rehearsals had begun, one after the other, and friends assured me that Matkowski had never been more superb, never more masculine than at these rehearsals when speaking my verses. I had already reserved a berth in a sleeper for Berlin when a telegram arrived at the last moment. postponement because of the illness of Matkowski. I believed it to be an excuse common in the theater when one wants to evade a promise or a date. But a week later, the newspapers published the news of Matkowski's death. My verses were the last that his wonderful lips had spoken. Finished, I said to myself. Vorbei, it's over with. Although two other important court theaters, Dresden and Kassel, wanted the play, my interest had become languid. I did not wish to think of an Achilles other than Matkowski. Just then, even more startling news arrived. A friend woke me one morning to tell me that Joseph Keynes had sent him to say that he had chanced upon the play and saw a part in it for himself. Not the Achilles that Matkowski wished to play, but the tragic opposite role of Thersites. He was going to get in touch with the Burg Theater at once. Its manager, Schlenther, a pioneer of the then current realism, had come from Berlin and, to the annoyance of the Viennese, directed the court theater on realistic principles. He wrote to me promptly that although he was aware of what was interesting in my drama, unfortunately, he did not see the possibility of any success beyond the premiere. Finished, I said to myself again, skeptical as I had always been towards myself and my literary work. Keynes, on the other hand, was bitter. He invited me to call upon him at once, and for the first time I saw before me the god of my youth whose hands and feet we gymnasium students would have liked to kiss. His body pliant as a feather, his face spiritual and lit up by handsome dark eyes, even in his 50th year. It was a joy to hear him speak. Every word, even in private conversation, had its purest outline, every consonant its sharp-cut precision, every vowel vibrated fully and clear. Even now, I cannot read such poems as I had once heard him recite, without his voice speaking at the same time, with its measured power, its perfect rhythm, its heroic vibration. Never since has it been such joy to hear the German language. And this man, whom I adored as a god, apologized to me, a novice, because he had not succeeded in putting through my play. But from now on, he said with emphasis, we were not to lose sight of each other. As a matter of fact, he had a request to make. I almost laughed that Keynes should request something from me. He was playing frequent guest engagements and had 2 one-act plays for those occasions. He needed a third, and what was shadowed in his mind was a short piece, in verse if possible, and preferably with one of those lyric cascades such as only he among German actors, because of his grandiose diction, could pour forth crystalline at one breath before an audience that was itself breathless. Could I not write such a one-act play for him? I promised to try. The will to do can sometimes, as Goethe says, command poesy. I outlined a sketch of a one-act play, Der Verwandelt Comedian, the transformed comedian, a featherweight rococo affair with 2 big lyrico-dramatic monologues incorporated. Involuntarily, I felt myself influenced by his desire in every word, and identified myself enthusiastically with Keynes's being and even sought to make his diction mine. Hence this made-to-order work became one of those happy accidents which come about not through mere craftsmanship, but by enthusiasm alone. After 3 weeks, I was able to show Keynes the half-finished sketch with one of the arias in its setting. Keynes was genuinely enthusiastic. He immediately recited the cascade twice, the second time with, to me, unforgettable perfection. How much time did I need? He asked, visibly impatient. A month. Excellent. That suited him perfectly. He was going on tour for a few weeks to Germany, and upon his return, he would begin rehearsals without delay, for this was to be a Burg Theater play. Then he promised me that he would include in it his repertory wherever he went, for it fitted him like a glove. Like a glove. Again and again he repeated these words, shaking my hand heartily 3 times. It was obvious that he had made the Burg Theater rebellious before his departure, for the director telephoned me in person, asked me to show him the one-act play in outline form, and accepted it in advance. The parts supporting Keynes were given to the cast so that they might read them. Again it seemed as if I were winning a grand prize on a modest stake. The Burg Theater, the pride of our city, and an actor who, with Duse, was the greatest of the times, in a play by me. It was almost too much for a beginner. There was only one possible danger, that Keynes might change his mind when the play was completed, but how improbable that was. Nevertheless, The impatience was now on my side. At last I read in the paper that Joseph Keynes had returned from his guest tour. For the sake of politeness, I waited 2 days so as not to rush in on him immediately upon his return. But on the third day, I took courage and handed my visiting card to the familiar old porter of the Hotel Sacker, where Keynes was staying at the time. Zuhören Hofschauspieler Keynes. The old man stared at me over his glasses in astonishment. But haven't you heard, Herr Doctor? No, I had not heard anything. They took him to the sanatorium this morning. He told me that Keynes had returned very ill from his tour, during which he had played his great parts, for the last time heroically mastering the most terrible pains before an unsuspecting audience. The next day he was operated on for cancer. According to the newspaper bulletins, we could still hope for his recovery, and I visited him on his sickbed. He lay there tired, emaciated, his dark eyes looking larger than usual in his wasted face, and I was shocked. His eternally young, eloquent lips were outlined with an icy gray mustache, and I saw an old, dying man before me. Sadly, he smiled at me. "Do you think the Lord will grant that I act in that piece of ours? That could make me well." But a few weeks later we stood at his coffin. One can readily understand my uneasiness at remaining in the dramatic field and the anxiety which ensued every time I presented a new piece to a theater. The fact that the two greatest actors of Germany had died while rehearsing my verses made me, I am not ashamed to confess it, superstitious. It was only after some years that I again took courage to enter the field of the theater, and when the new manager of the Burg Theater, Alfred Baron Berger, an eminent man of the theater and a master of declamation, immediately accepted the drama, I scanned the selected cast anxiously and, paradoxically, sighed with relief. Thank God! Not a famous name there. There was no one upon whom fate could wreak her wrath. But nonetheless, the improbable occurred. If one shuts the door upon misfortune, it will sneak in through another. I had thought only of the actors and not of the manager, who had intended himself to direct my tragedy, Das Haus im Meer, the House by the Sea, and had already prepared the prompt book. I had not thought of Alfred Baron Berger. Truly enough, a fortnight before the date of the first rehearsal he was dead. The curse that seemed to hang over my dramatic works was still operating. Even when, more than a decade later, Jeremiah and Volpone coursed the earth after the war in every possible language, I felt none too sure. And I acted consciously against my own interests when, in 1931, I completed a new piece, Das Lambda Armen, the One You Lamb. One day, after I had sent the manuscript to him, I received a telegram from my friend Alexander Moisey asking that I reserve the lead for him for the premiere. Moisey, who had brought from his Italian homeland a sensuous euphony, such as had never before been heard on the German stage, was then the only great successor to Joseph Keynes. Enchanting in appearance, clever, alive, and moreover a kindly and inspiring person, he invested every play with some of his own personal magic. I could not have asked for a more ideal actor for the part. And yet, when he had made this proposal to me, the memory of Matkowski and Keynes stirred within me, and I declined on a pretext without telling him the real reason. I knew that he had inherited from Keynes the Iffland ring, which is always bequeathed by Germany's greatest actor to his greatest successor. Was he also to inherit Keynes's fate? In any case, as far as I was concerned, I had no wish to be the cause of misfortune for a third time to the greatest German actor of the time. And so, because of superstition and out of love for him, I renounced what would have been the most perfect interpretation of my play. And yet, I was unable to protect him by my renunciation, although I refused to give him the part. And though I have never given a new piece to the stage since that time, I was still to be enmeshed in the misfortune of others without the slightest fault on my part. I am quite aware that I shall be suspected of telling a ghost story. Matkowski and Keynes, these might be explained as being cruel chance. But why Moisey after them, when I had not given him the part and had not written a new drama since? This is what happened, years later, and I am getting ahead of my story. I was in Zurich in the summer of 1935, when, with no previous warning, I received a telegram from my friend Moisey from Milan, telling me that he was coming to see me that evening and that I was to await him without fail. How strange, I thought. What can be so pressing? I had no new play and had been more than indifferent towards the theater for years. Naturally, I awaited his coming with pleasure, for I loved this warm, affectionate man like a brother. He rushed up to me from the train, and we embraced in the Italian fashion. We were still in the automobile on the way from the station when he began, with his marvelous impatience, to tell me what it was that I could do for him. Pirandello had done him a special honor by giving him the rights for the premiere of his new play, Non sia mai. It was not for the Italian premiere, but for the world premiere, which was to take place in Vienna in the German language. It was the first time that such an Italian master had given precedence to a non-Italian country. He had never even accorded it to Paris. But Pirandello had a particular wish. He feared that in the translation the musical quality, the subtleties of his prose might be lost, so it was his desire that I, whose lingual art he had long valued, translate the piece into German and not some chance translator. Pirandello had, naturally, hesitated to approach me. How could he expect me to waste my time with translations? He had said, and so Moisey had taken it upon himself to transmit Pirandello's wish. As a matter of fact, I had been done with translating for years. But I respected Pirandello, with whom I had had some pleasant meetings, too much to disappoint him, and above all it was a pleasure to be able to give so close a friend as Moisey a token of comradeship. I put my own work aside for a week or two, and not many weeks later Pirandello's play, in my translation, was announced for the world premiere in Vienna, an event which, for political reasons, too, was to be made particularly impressive. Pirandello had promised to be present, and as Mussolini was then still the avowed patron of Austria, every official of consequence, led by the Chancellor, announced his attendance. The evening was to be made the occasion of demonstrating Austro-Italian friendship, in truth, the protectorate of Italy over Austria. When the rehearsals were to begin, I happened to be in Vienna. I looked forward with pleasure to seeing Pirandello again, and I was curious to hear the words of my translation in Moisey's musical voice. But with ghost-like similarity there occurred, after a quarter of a century, the same event. When I opened my newspaper early in the morning, I read that Moisey had arrived from Switzerland suffering with a severe attack of grippe, and that the rehearsals would have to be postponed because of his illness. Grippe, I thought. That cannot be serious. But my heart began to race as I approached the hotel. This time, thank God, the Grand Hotel and not the Hotel Sacker, to visit my sick friend. The memory of my futile visit to Cannes made me shudder. And again, after some 25 years, the same thing occurred to the greatest of German actors. It was too late to see Moisey, for he was already delirious. 2 days later, as had been the case with Cannes, I stood at his coffin instead of at his rehearsal. I have related out of turn the last fulfillment of the mysterious spell connected with my theatrical efforts. Naturally, I see in this recurrence nothing more than chance. But undoubtedly the closely succeeding deaths of Matkowski and Cannes had a definite effect upon the direction of my life at that time. If Matkowski in Berlin and Cannes in Vienna had acted in the first dramas of a 26-year-old, then it is quite possible that, thanks to their great art which could have made a success of even the weakest play, I would rapidly have become widely known and perhaps undeservedly so, and would thus have been deprived of years of slow learning and experience of the world. It was natural enough for me to think that I was being persecuted by fate, since at the very start the theater had so temptingly offered me undreamed of possibilities only to snatch them cruelly from me at the last moment. But it is only early in life that one believes fate to be identical with chance. Later one knows that the actual course of one's life was determined from within. However confusedly and meaninglessly our way may deviate from our desires, after all it does lead us inevitably to our invisible goal. Beyond Europe, did time go more quickly in the past than it does today, when it is packed with events that will change our world to the very vitals for hundreds of years to come? Or do the last years of my youth before the First European War seem somewhat blurred because they were spent in regular work? I wrote, I published, my name was known in Germany, and, to some extent, abroad. I had a following, and, what is better testimony to a certain individuality, I already had opponents. All the great newspapers of the Reich were open to me, and I no longer had to proffer material, but was asked to contribute. But I cherish no secret belief that what I did and wrote in those years would have significance today. All our ambitions, our sorrows, our disappointments and exasperations look Lilliputian now. Perforce the dimensions of this day have changed our point of view of things. Had I begun this book some years ago, I would have written of conversations with Gerhard Hauptmann, with Arthur Schnitzler, Bierhoffman, Dimmel, Pirandello, Wassermann, Scholamash, and Anatole France. The last named, by the way, was very amusing. The old gentleman told us improper stories the whole afternoon, but with meditative seriousness and an indescribable grace. I could tell of great premieres, those of Gustav Mahler's 10th Symphony in Munich, the Rosenkavalier in Dresden, those of Karsavina and Nijinsky, for I got about much and was an eager witness of many historical artistic events. But all that remains unrelated to the problems of the present day is out of date when measured by our stricter standard of importance. Today, those men of my youth who held my attention to literature seemed far less important than those who drew it away towards reality. Chief among them was a man who had to govern the destiny of the German Reich in one of its most tragic epochs, and who was struck by the National Socialists' first murderous shot 11 years before Hitler seized power, Walter Rathenau. Our friendly relations were of long standing and very cordial. They had begun in an unusual manner. Maximilian Harden, whose magazine Die Zukunft was a determining influence in the last decades of Emperor Wilhelm's empire, was one of the first persons to whom I owed advancement at the age of 19. It was Harden whom Bismarck himself had pushed into politics. The chancellor liked using him as his mouthpiece or lightning rod, who broke ministers, who brought about the explosion of the Eulenburg affair, and caused the imperial palace to tremble each week for fear of new attacks and disclosures. Yet for all this, Harden's real love was the theater and literature. One day there appeared in the Zukunft a series of aphorisms, signed with a pseudonym that I can no longer recall, which struck me because of their unusual wisdom and compact expression. As one of his regular contributors, I wrote to Harden, "Who is this new man? I have not read such finely polished epigrams in years." The reply did not come from Harden, but from one who signed himself Walter Rathenau, and who, as I learned from his letters and from other sources, was none other than the son of the almighty director of the Berlin Electric Company, and was himself an industrialist and a director in countless companies. One of the new German far-sighted merchants, to use a term of Jean Paul's. He wrote to me very cordially and appreciatively that mine had been his first encouragement for a literary endeavor. Although he was at least 10 years older than I, he confided his doubts whether to publish an entire book of his thoughts and aphorisms at that time. He was an outsider, he felt, and until then had concentrated his activity in the field of economics. I encouraged him wholeheartedly. We continued to correspond, and when I next visited Berlin, I called him on the telephone. A hesitant voice replied, "Ah, it is you. What a pity. I am leaving for South Africa at 6 tomorrow morning." I interrupted, saying, "Then of course we will meet some other time." But the voice continued slowly and reflectively. "No, wait a minute. My afternoon is taken up with conferences. Tonight I must go to the ministry and then to a club dinner. Could you come here at 11:15? Of course I agreed. We chatted until 2 the next morning. He left at 6, on behalf of the German emperor, as I learned later, for Southwest Africa. I relate this detail because it is so characteristic of Rathenau. This very busy man always had time. I saw him during the direst days of war and shortly before the Locarno Conference. And a few days before his assassination, I rode with him in the same automobile and through the same street in which he was murdered. Although every minute of his day was always allocated, he was ready to turn from one subject to another without the least effort, for his mind was always on the alert, an instrument of such precision and rapidity as I have never seen in anyone else. He spoke fluently as if he were reading from an invisible page, and yet each individual sentence was so plastically and clearly formed that, had it been taken down in shorthand, his conversation would have been a perfect exposition, ready for the press. He spoke French, English, and Italian as well as he did German. His memory never failed him, and he required no special preparation for any subject. In speaking with him, one felt stupid, faultily educated, uncertain, and confused in the presence of his calm, deliberate, and clear-thinking objectivity. But there was something in the blinding brilliance, the crystal clarity of his thinking, just as there was something in the choice furniture and the fine pictures in his home that made one feel uncomfortable. His mind had the effect of an ingeniously contrived apparatus, his home that of a museum. One could never really get warm in his feudal Queen Louise palace in Brandenburg. Its order was too obvious, its arrangement too studied, its cleanliness too clean. His thinking had the transparency of glass, hence seemed unsubstantial. Rarely have I sensed the tragedy of the Jew more strongly than in his personality which, with all of its apparent superiority, was full of a deep unrest and uncertainty. My other friends, for example Verhaeren, Ellen Key, and Bazalgette, were not a tenth as clever, not 100th as universal or as worldly wise as he was, but they were secure within themselves. In Rathenau's case, I always felt that, in spite of his immeasurable cleverness, his feet were not firmly on the ground. His entire existence was a single conflict of constantly changing contradictions. He had inherited all imaginable power from his father, and yet had no wish to be his heir. He was a merchant, but fancied himself an artist. He had millions and toyed with socialistic ideas. He felt himself to be a Jew and flirted with Christ. He thought internationally and worshipped Prussianism. He dreamt of the people's rule, and yet was highly honored every time he was received and consulted by Emperor Wilhelm, whose weaknesses and vanity he saw through intuitively, without being able to master his own vanity. And so it was perhaps that his ceaseless activity was nothing but an opiate to cover up an inner nervousness and to deaden the loneliness that surrounded his inner life. It was only in the hour of responsibility, when in 1919, after the breakdown of the German armies, the most difficult task in history, that of leading the disorganized republic from chaos to new life, fell to him, that the tremendous potential forces within him suddenly became a single force. And in staking his life on a single idea, the salvation of Europe, he attained the greatness which was innate to his genius. Besides many a glance into far lands in the course of enlivening conversations, which in intellectual intensity and lucidity could perhaps only be compared with those of Hofmannsthal, Valery, and Count Kaiserling, I also owe to Rathenau, who broadened my horizon from the purely literary to the contemporary historical, my first impulse to go outside of Europe. "You cannot understand England," he said to me, "as long as you merely know the island, nor our continent unless you have gone beyond it at least once. You're a free man. Make use of your freedom. Literature is a wonderful profession because haste plays no part in it. A year more or less is of no importance for a real book. Why don't you go to India and to America?" This chance remark sank in, and I determined to follow his advice without delay. India itself had a more sinister and depressing effect upon me than I would have thought possible. I was shocked by the misery of the emaciated figures, the joyless seriousness in their somber glances, the often cruel monotony of the landscape, and, more than all else, the rigid division of classes and races of which I had already had a taste on board ship. Two charming girls, black-eyed and slim, well-educated and well-mannered, discreet and elegant, were on the same vessel. I noticed on the very first day that they kept at a distance, or were kept at a distance by some invisible barrier. They did not appear at the dances, they did not enter a general conversation, but sat apart reading English or French books. It was only on the second or third day that I became aware that it was not they who avoided the society of the English, but the others who drew back from these half-castes. Although these two attractive girls were the daughters of a Parsi merchant and a Frenchwoman. For 2 or 3 years, in a boarding school in Lausanne and in a finishing school in England, there had been no discrimination, but on the ship going to India a cool, invisible, but none the less horrid social exile had set in. This was my first sight of the pest of the racial purity mania, which has become more dangerous for our world of today than the actual plague had been centuries ago. This encounter served to sharpen my observation from the outset. With some shame I partook of the respect, long since vanished through our own fault, shown the European as if he was some sort of white god, who, when on a tourist trip such as up Adam's Peak in Ceylon, had a retinue of 12 or 14 servants, for a lesser number would be beneath his dignity. I could not rid myself of the uneasy feeling that the coming decades and centuries would bring about transformations and changes in these absurd conditions, which we Europeans in our comfortable and fondly imagined security did not dare to dream about. Because of this impression, I did not see India as something romantic, as Pierre Lodi did through rose-colored spectacles, but as an admonition. It was not the beautiful temples, the weathered palaces, nor the Himalaya landscapes, which gave me the most on this trip as far as my education was concerned, but the people whom I met, people of other sorts and other worlds than a writer from the European interior commonly met. Whoever traveled outside Europe in those days, when one spent more frugally and before Cook's tours had spread over the world, was usually an outstanding person in his particular class. The merchant would not be a small retailer with the restrictions of his level, but a wholesaler. The physician was likely to be a real scientist, the entrepreneur of the race of the conquistador race, daring, lavish, ruthless, and even the writer a man of superior intellectual curiosity. Throughout the long days and nights of the trip, there was not yet the radio to fill them with chatter. I learned more in my association with these novel types about the push and pull that move the world than I did from 100 books. Distance from home alters spiritual standards. Many a detail that had formerly occupied me unduly seemed petty after my return, and I ceased to regard our Europe as the eternal axis of the universe. One of the men whom I met on my trip to India has achieved an immeasurable, even if not publicly apparent, influence upon the history of our time. From Calcutta to Indochina, and on a riverboat headed up the Irrawaddy, I spent hours every day with Karl Haushofer and his wife. He was on his way to Japan as German military attaché, erect and slim, spare-faced and eagle-nosed. He gave me my first insight into the unusual qualities and the intrinsic discipline of a German general staff officer. I had, of course, sometimes associated with military men in Vienna, amiable, cordial, and even jolly young fellows who, for the most part, had come from families of restricted means and had taken refuge in the uniform and sought to derive such pleasure as the service could yield. Haushofer, however, as one sensed at once, came from middle-class people of culture. His father had published some poems and was, I believe, a university professor, and his education, besides military science, was comprehensive. Ordered to make a first-hand study of the various theaters of the Russo-Japanese War, he and his wife had familiarized themselves with the Japanese language and even its literature. He exemplified the fact that every science, even the military, when pursued profoundly, must necessarily push beyond its own limits and impinge on all the other sciences. He worked all day on board ship, followed the landscape with binoculars, kept a diary, made notes, consulted dictionaries. I rarely saw him without a book in hand. A precise observer, he was well able to describe things effectively. In conversation with him, I learned much of the enigmatic Orient. After my return home, I kept up cordial relations with the Haushofer family. We exchanged letters and visited each other in Salzburg and Munich. A severe pulmonary illness which confined him for a year to Davos or Arosa kept him from the army and compelled him to go over to science. But he recovered and was able to take a command in the World War. At the time of the collapse, I often thought of him with great sympathy. I could easily imagine how much he, who had labored for years at building up German mastery and perhaps also at its war machine in his obscure retirement, must have suffered in seeing Japan, where he had made many friends among the victorious opponents. Soon it was evident that he was one of the first to think systematically and in a broad-gauge way of the rebuilding of Germany's position. He edited a journal of geopolitics, and, as is so often the case, I failed to understand the deeper meaning of this new movement at its inception. I honestly believed that it was concerned only with the play of forces in the cooperation of nations, and I took the expression Lebensraum of nations, which I think Haushofer coined, in Spengler's sense, as the relative energy, changing with the ages, which every nation once in its life cycle produces. And Haushofer's summons to study the individual traits of the nations more closely, and to create a permanent educational apparatus on a scientific basis, appeared quite proper to me, for I conceived such investigations as calculated to draw nations closer together. Who knows, Haushofer's original intentions may have been quite unpolitical. However that may be, I read his books, he quotes me once in them, with great interest and without the least suspicion, and heard objectively thinking persons praise his lectures as being unusually instructive. No one charged that he intended his ideas to serve a new policy of power and aggression. They were meant simply to give new ideological motivation to the old Greater Germany claims. But one day in Munich, when I chanced to mention his name, someone said, in a matter-of-course tone, "Ah, Hitler's friend." Nothing could have astonished me more. First of all, Haushofer's wife was by no means racially pure, and his talented and very agreeable sons could never have met the requirements of the Nuremberg Jewish laws. Moreover, I could see no basis of intellectual relation between a highly cultivated, cosmopolitan scholar and a rabid agitator who was mad on the subject of Germanism in its narrowest and most brutal sense. But one of Haushofer's pupils had been Rudolf Hess, and he had brought about the connection. Hitler, though himself far from receptive to unfamiliar ideas, possessed, from the outset, the instinct to appropriate whatever might serve his personal ambitions. Therefore, National Socialist politics accepted geopolitics and pumped it dry, Hitler using as much as fitted his purpose. It was always the technique of National Socialism to supply an ideological and pseudo-moral foundation for its thoroughly unequivocal egotistical instinct for power. The word Lebensraum finally proved a neat cloak for its naked will to aggression, an apparently innocent, but only vaguely definable word that would justify any annexation, no matter how arbitrary, as an ethical and ethnological necessity. So it was my old traveling companion who, whether consciously and willingly I do not know, was responsible, to the world's detriment, for that fundamental change in Hitler's aims, originally strictly directed to nationalism and racial purity, which, through the Lebensraum theory, took form in the slogan, Zuerst erobern or Deutschland und dann die ganz Welt. First we will conquer Germany, and then the entire world. This was as senseless an example of the transformation of a single pregnant formula into deed and destiny through the power immanent in language as the earlier formulation of the encyclopedis of the rule of raison, which finally changed to its very opposite, terror and mass emotion. As far as I know, Haushofer never held a prominent position in the party. Perhaps he never was a party member. At any rate, I cannot, like the imaginative journalists, see him as a cunning gray eminence who, concealed in the background, invents the most dangerous schemes and whispers them to the Führer. But there can be no doubt that it was his theories, rather than any of Hitler's most rabid advisors, which either consciously or unconsciously drove the aggressive policy of National Socialism from the narrow national to the universal. Only posterity, with better documentation than is available to our contemporaries, will be able to place him in the proper perspective of history. Before long, this first overseas trip was followed by another, this time to America. It, too, was prompted by no other purpose than to see the world and, if possible, a bit of the future which lay before us. I truly believe that I was one of the very few writers who went over not to earn money or to exploit America journalistically, but solely to compare a rather uncertain impression of the new continent with the reality. My impression, I declare it frankly, was a fairly romantic one. For me, America was Walt Whitman, the land of the new rhythm and the coming world brotherhood. Once again before I sailed, I read the wild, cataractic pour of the great Camerado's long lines. And so I entered Manhattan with an open fraternal feeling instead of the usual arrogance of the European. I remember that the first thing that I did when I got to the hotel was to ask the porter to direct me to Walt Whitman's grave. But my desire greatly embarrassed the poor Italian who had never even heard the name. My first impression was overpowering, although New York did not yet have the enchanting night beauty which it now has. The rushing cascades of light in Times Square were not yet present, nor the city's dreamlike heaven which, with its billions of artificial stars, glitters at the real ones in the sky. The appearance of the city as well as the traffic lacked the daring grandeur of today, for the new architecture was only trying itself out uncertainly, with an occasional skyscraper, and the astonishing development of taste in show windows and decorations had only modestly set in. But to look down from the Brooklyn Bridge, with its constant gentle swaying, at the harbor and to wander about in the stone canyons of the avenues, was discovery and excitement enough. But after 2 or 3 days it gave way to another more pronounced feeling, that of extreme solitude. I had nothing to do in New York, and at that time a leisured person could not have been more out of place anywhere. There were not yet cinemas in which to while away an hour, nor the small, comfortable cafeterias, nor so many art galleries, libraries, and museums as there are now. In matters cultural, everything was still far behind our Europe. After 2 or 3 days of loyally doing the museums and other notable sights, I was swept along like a rudderless boat in the icy, windy streets. Finally, this sense of the aimlessness of my wandering became so strong that I could overcome it only by some positive artifice. I invented a game for myself. I pretended that I was friendless and alone, a jobless immigrant with my last $7 in my pocket. Do then, I said to myself, what they have to do. Imagine that you are forced to earn your own living after 3 days. Look around and see how one begins here as a stranger without connections or friends to find a position. So I wandered from agency to agency and examined the lists tacked on their doors. Here a baker was wanted, there a temporary clerk who knew French and Italian, here a clerk for a bookshop. This last, incidentally, was the first opportunity for my imaginary self. And so I climbed up 3 flights of iron stairs, asked about the salary, and compared it with the prices for a room in the Bronx which I had seen advertised in the newspaper. After 2 days of job hunting, I had theoretically found 5 jobs by which I could have made my living. In this manner, I had convinced myself more vividly than by mere strolling about how much room, how much opportunity there was in this young country for anyone willing to work, and that impressed me. Also, through this experience at agencies and interviews in shops and offices, I gained an insight into the divine freedom of the country. No one had asked me about my nationality, my religion, my origin, and, fantastic as it may seem to the world of today with its fingerprinting, visas, and police certificates, I had traveled without a passport. But here were jobs that but waited for takers, that spoke volumes. Without the hindering interference of the state or formalities or trade unions, in that now legendary freedom a deal was made in a minute. Through this job hunting, I learned more about America in those very first few days than in all the succeeding weeks when I traveled comfortably to Philadelphia, Boston, Baltimore, and Chicago. I was always alone except in Boston, where I spent a few convivial hours with Charles Loeffler, who had composed the music for some of my poems. On only one occasion was the complete anonymity of my existence interrupted by a surprise. I remember the moment clearly. I was strolling down a broad avenue in Philadelphia and halted before a large bookshop to find at least in the names of the authors something known or familiar to me. Suddenly I started. In the window 6 or 7 German books stood on the left, and from one of them my name jumped out at me. I stared as if enchanted and began to meditate. Something of this self of mine that was being driven through these strange streets unknown and apparently futilely, unknown and observed by none. Something of this self had preceded me. The bookseller must have written my name on an order slip, and so caused my book to make the 10 days' journey over the ocean. My desolation left me for the moment, and when 2 years ago I again visited Philadelphia, I instinctively sought this window again and again. I had lost courage to go as far as San Francisco. Hollywood had not yet been invented, but at least there was one other spot from which I could fulfill my longing to see the Pacific Ocean, for since my childhood I had been fascinated by the accounts of the early circumnavigators. What is more, it was a spot that has since disappeared which mortal I will never behold again. The lost mounds of earth of the Panama Canal, which was then still building. I had gone down there in a small ship by way of Bermuda and Haiti. Through Verhaeren, our poetic generation had learned to admire the technical wonders of our age with the same enthusiasm with which our ancestors admired Roman antiquity. Panama itself was an unforgettable sight. The river bed excavated by machinery, its ochre yellow burning the eye even through dark glasses, the infernal air filled with millions and billions of mosquitoes whose victims could be seen in endless rows in the cemetery. How many had died for this enterprise which Europe had begun and America was to complete? And only now, after 30 years of catastrophes and disappointments, it was becoming a reality. A few more months of final labor on the sluices, and then pressure on an electric button, and the two oceans, after thousands of years, would unite for eternity. But I was one of the last of this day to see them still separate while fully aware of what was to come. It was a good leave-taking from America, this site of its greatest creative accomplishment. Light and shadow over Europe.
Okay, have a rest, have a cup of tea.